Okay, good morning, everyone, and very welcome to SEPS, even if only virtually. I'm Cinzia Cidi, I'm Director of Research at SEPS, and I'm really very pleased to open this meeting today, a compass for the EU economy, which indicators for the update of the industrial strategy. This event is organized in cooperation with the European Roundtable of Industrialists, ERT. This is a platform of the leaders of the largest businesses in Europe. And the entire event is part of a SEPS initiative. I'm pretty sure most of the audience knows what I'm talking about. This is the task force on the industrial strategy. And we expect actually the findings or some key messages from this meeting also to contribute to the final report of the task force, which is planned to be published in April. Now, the meeting of today is focusing on an aspect which is somewhat specific, but in fact, we believe is very important for the thinking around the entire industrial strategy. And the focus of today is really on the use of indicators to monitor the performance or the progress of the EU industrial strategy, and potentially also to benchmark objectives. Now, I have to say that in the context of the team working on the industrial strategy, this idea of having indicators has triggered quite a lot of discussion. And it is basically not by chance that we are having this meeting today. And in particular, a publication by the ERT, and you will hear about this in a moment, titled Putting the EU Industrial Strategy into Action, KPIs for Tracking Progress and Benchmarking Competitiveness, has inspired actually some of the discussion that we had. And now the reason for this is that basically we realized that if you want to identify indicators in order to track the progress, you need to clearly identify your objectives. And in the report of the ERT, the competitiveness of the EU industry is clearly a key objective. Now, in the context of our discussion, next to competitiveness, all the broader objectives have been put on the table. And across different working groups, the issue of sustainability, intended like economic, social, and environmental sustainability, has emerged as a new element, if you want, a new overarching objective, together with resilience. Now, I think that one very fundamental question is to what extent such objectives should be incorporated as wider objectives of the EU industrial strategy. And on this, I think we need to keep in mind two views. The first one is that we are discussing an EU strategy, and the EU stakeholders are EU society at large, with businesses as citizens and many other actors. So in this sense, it's not simply a strategy of the EU industry. So in this sense, the EU dimension is relevant. And in this sense, it could put the EU industrial strategy at the center of a wider vision about how the economy should work and could work. On the other side, there is full awareness that the EU industrial strategy cannot tackle each and every challenge of the EU. So in this sense, we are really in a situation where there is an open discussion to see to what extent these additional objectives, which are relevant for society at large, should work more as a compass for the economy. That's from where the title of this event comes, and to what extent can be incorporated into the EU industrial strategy. I think this is a big question. It's very overarching, but I think it's very crucial for guiding the thinking. So I would leave it here for the moment, and I would like to give the floor to Frank. Frank Emerskirk is the Secretary General of the ERT, and I would like to invite him to share his thoughts about the use of the indicators for the EU industrial strategy. Frank, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning to you all. And Cynthia, thank you for your opening words. And SEPS, thank you for hosting this important event. Well, let me be frank. Our members, so the CEOs of, let's say, of the leading European companies from automotive to tech to food to energy, pharmaceuticals, our members are worried about the lack of implementation of the EU industrial strategy. And that's why we published our report on KPIs in November 2020, because over the past 15 years, we have seen numerous false starts of the EU industry strategy. So this time, with the renewed strategy, it really needs to count. And revising the strategy makes sense with COVID and everything what happens, but we need to put implementation in focus. It would be a missed opportunity to boost industry when it's needed most. And our twin transitions, the Green Deal, digital, can only happen with industry strategy at its core. Europe, von der Leyen said, has the ambition to be a geopolitical player. We can only be a geopolitical player if we have a team Europe which also consists of globally competitive, leading, innovative companies based in Europe. So that's why we published our KPI paper. It was an example, it's a gift, it's present to the Commission, to the member states, and it contains 28 specific KPIs with targets for the year of 2030 on 4 categories: on output performance, on internal processes. Internal processes also cover the topic of efficiency as well as sustainability. On the future orientation, that's the innovation part, and on the global relationships. It's Europe's place in the world. How is our performance not doing compared to other regions? So not just intra-EU, not member state to member state. That could also be an incentive to step up, but also, how we're doing towards the rest of the world. And all of these 28 KPIs were based on the priorities set by the Commission in its recent industrial strategy. So it's what do we want? How do we measure? Let me conclude with some recommendations from the European Roundtable for Industry. First, business and political leaders need more and more regular data to measure the progress of our competitiveness. Secondly, we recommend a balanced scorecard with a wide variety of KPIs to track the performance internationally. Third, we recommend not only to focus on these 14 ecosystems, which are now the talk of the town and the priority of Breton. It's fine also to measure the ecosystems, but make sure that we also measure the horizontal areas of competitiveness that matter to all the companies, such as ease of doing business, economic openness, upskilling, reskilling, R&D investments, labor productivity, electricity prices, key infrastructure like the rollout of 5G. It's horrible how slow Europe is in the rollout of 5G. So not just the ecosystems, also horizontal. That's 3. 4, only with a significant number of indicators and thus sufficient data, we can come to evidence-based policymaking on investment decisions, and if necessary, to adjust course. 5th, on accountability. Of course, it's not the sole responsibility of the European Commission itself on specific outcomes in terms of competitiveness. It's also about us companies. It's about the performance and, let's say, the conditions set by the member states. But it would be useful if the Commission also regularly monitors the progress through competitiveness reports. It's a pity that this had stopped and it's not longer being done. Finally, clear facts and figures will provide a compass how to get out of the crisis and to keep competitiveness, investment in Europe high on the agenda. And this is not about companies. It's not about the big companies. It's about society. It's about our future jobs. It's about our future prosperity. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Frank. I hand over to Andrea for the moderation of the panel. Andrea.
Thanks to Cinzia, thanks to Frank for these introductions that I think set the stage perfectly for a discussion that promises to be very rich, also because the European Roundtable for Industry has given this first input last year during the pandemic on something that was then specifically subject to a call from the Council to the Commission to work on the relaunch, on the update of the industrial strategy by specifying indicators. Now, among other things, obviously, that you will see in a forthcoming communication. The issue, however, is very complex because depending on the way in which you approach the issue of indicators, you might want to select indicators that are more, let's say, specific to the competitiveness of the European industry, or you might want to select indicators that are more directly reflecting the medium to long-term goals that the European institutions are specifying for the EU agenda as a whole. And obviously, in selecting indicators, you are normally inspired and enlightened and reassured by one motto that is very, recurring in the global community: what gets measured gets done. But at the same time, this gives even more responsibility on policymakers that choose indicators, because if you only do what you measure, or you primarily do what you measure, you rather might want to measure the good things, the appropriate things. So in the world of indicators, in the literature, we typically distinguish between different types of indicators, right? We distinguish between more input indicators. We distinguish output or outcome or impact indicators, depending on what you actually want to capture. And ultimately, the ideal is in many cases having a mix of them in your roster of indicators, but including at least some of the impact indicators, which sometimes are the more difficult to measure, because you need to establish some form of causality between for example, input indicators and the ultimate outcomes and impacts that will be observed in society. So to give you one example, the different decade-long strategies that we've had, for example, the Lisbon strategy and then Europe 2020, have normally come with an indicator or with a target of reaching a level of expenditure in research and development of 3% of GDP. And that was criticized because it is only an input indicator and it doesn't tell you whether this investment in research and development is actually producing outcomes. Now, the further complexity there is due to the fact that the current EU agenda is clearly oriented towards frontiers for this decade, which go beyond competitiveness. I'm talking about things like resilience at the moment. So do we have indicators that in the future industrial strategy that somehow represents the prominence of resilience in the current EU agenda? Obviously, sustainable development, sustainability, or more specifically, the targets that are subsumed under the umbrella of the Green Deal with the just transition, but also subjective well-being, which is subject to heated debate at the moment. So how are these concepts going to be, let's say, cooked by the Commission into a unique recipe for the industrial strategy? How much of this will be about competitiveness? How much of this will be about other elements? And this is extremely important, again, because you normally try to focus on what you can measure to track progress and to continue, and also to adopt remedies if you see that you're not delivering on specific indicators. So the discussion that we have today is really, really important. What I also would be interested in stimulating our panelists on is on the governance of the indicators, meaning who is going to track the progress, how, and what happens if you discover that some of these indicators Europe is not on track with some of these indicators. And in order to discuss all these elements, we decided to create a panel that represents what we expect to be complementary views, let's say, and certainly different views. We will hear first from Amélie Roux from Saint-Gobain, who I understand has been materially contributing also to the publication of the European Roundtable for Industry. So she also represents this first very well-shaped proposal that we've seen in November. Later, I will give the floor to Jarko Havas from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Jarko will mostly represent, I expect, you never know, you might surprise us, but the circular economy perspective, so the more environmental perspective. We will hear from Jude Kirton-Darling later from Industrial, who we expect will represent the union's perspective. So if you wish, somehow the social dimension and in particular the rights of workers in the industrial transition. And we will then land on Paolo Cassini, who is the person in that at European Commission DG GROW that is focusing on the selection and the future presentation of these indicators. So we will see whether in discussing those issues, Paolo will change his mind twice, 3 times, or maybe he has his ideas already firmly settled in his head, and he will present to us what the Commission has in mind. So without further ado, and to give you a little bit the framing of the discussion and what you should expect in the coming minutes, I give the floor to Amélie for her presentation. And thanks for being with us, Amélie. It's a pleasure to have you. And over to you for your first, let's say, statement and presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for this introduction. Just a few words maybe to start, to introduce Saint-Gobain. We are a world leader in terms of materials. So we produce, we design, we produce, and we distribute materials, mostly in the construction environment. And as such, we are a leader in terms of energy renovation materials, but also we produce materials for all types of industrial segments, transportation, infrastructure, etc. We have sales of around 40 billion euros, and we operate in nearly 70 countries. But it's true that our natural market is the EU. The EU, together with the UK, represents approximately 2/3 of our sales. So in this background, you understand that as an EU company, we are very the EU industrial strategy is a very important framework for us. It really sets out the framework in which we operate. We are strongly involved in the transition. We are convinced that the digital transition and the green transition are absolutely essential for the future prosperity of our societies, well beyond our own corporate. So one example, we have recently announced very ambitious targets in terms of carbon emission cuts by 2050 and 2030, and we have committed to invest 100 million euros every year for that goal. A large part of that will go to our EU factories and operations. These are huge amounts for us that will be dedicated to the greening of our industrial processes. And you know, from our perspective, it's very important when we decide to invest them to have the right signal from the EU authorities, to have a stable regulatory environment, and to have a stable incentive framework that ensures that our decisions are well optimized. And that's what the EU industrial strategy is providing us. It's providing us this anchor and this overall framework in which we make our decisions for this very important transition of our operations. So in this regard, the EU industrial strategy that was published last year is a good step. Is a step in the right direction. It specifically addresses the twin transitions. It also makes a better balance with the competition policy, acknowledging that EU companies regularly face unfair competition from foreign competitors, and we know concretely what it means through some of our subsidiaries. So the step forward for us in terms of the update of the EU policy is, of course, to understand what the EU Commission will come up with in terms of its update, and it's also in terms of implementation. As I told you, we are at the moment where we're doing heavy investment for our twin transitions, and we need to know, in which framework this is going to take place. I should say that the COVID-19 crisis has made it even more important, given how fast the US and China are moving in terms of industrial capacity. So there are two messages here that I'd like to share with you regarding the future of this industrial strategy and its implementation. The first one, when we want to ensure that the EU industrial strategy is implemented, we need some enhanced cooperation between corporates and the European Commission, just to make sure that the European Commission really understands the economic reality of industrial companies. It's sometimes hard to bridge the gap, between the EU administration and the reality we are facing. I can take an example which is not directly into the EU industrial strategy, but very closely related to. It's the taxonomy. Clearly, the first draft of the taxonomy that was devised by the European Commission was very much homemade by the European Commission with very limited interactions with industrial companies. And as a result of that, typically most of our activities are excluded from the taxonomy, while most of our businesses is actually dedicated to energy renovation of buildings. So, and that clearly reflects this this lack of discussion and cooperation and the understanding of the realities of our businesses. So the second message that's important is that if you want to actually implement this EU strategy, you need to set up targets and you need to set up KPIs. That's what industrial companies do. Say, for example, we have this very long-term goal of 2050 of reaching net zero carbon by 2050. This is a very long-term objective. So we've set up intermediate targets at 2025, 2030 with dedicated funds, which I've mentioned, is 100 million per year. And we have set up indicators that we track and that we publish every year. And we've done this not just for our carbon emissions, we've done this on all fields of our corporate and social responsibility. So typically we have targets and KPIs set up for gender parity, for diversity, for the circular economy, for health and safety, etc., etc. So these KPIs are just a very powerful management tool when it comes to embarking everyone. At the level of our company, the management sets these targets and these KPIs, and then it helps align everyone. And I think it may not be always relevant to compare the functioning of a corporate with that of an administration like the EU, but in that very specific case of KPIs, I think it does make sense because it helps align the objectives, well, specify and clarify the objectives of the European Commission, and to align everyone, including industrial companies. Okay. And if such KPIs are set up, it doesn't mean that the EU would be considered as the sole responsible for achieving those targets. It's a shared responsibility, and as industrial companies, we do accept the responsibility for that. But it helps embark us, on a common goal. So I think you can discuss then, on the number specifically of indicators, on the type of indicators you want. But clearly, I think there are a number of principles that could be useful and that could be replicated from the way corporates operate. First, I think what's important is to set up an appropriate time horizon for KPIs. You don't want to just stick to the 2050 deadline. It's too way off, and we need intermediate targets. 2025, 2030 is an appropriate one. It leaves enough time to ensure that the transition is well underway. Then you need to set up KPIs also that would remain relevant over the course of this lifetime. So it means having some kind of generic KPIs, but also you have to be ready to adjust them, either because you've achieved them very rapidly or because things are changing and the environment is changing. Typically on our digital transition, we are adjusting our KPIs on a much more frequent basis than on other on other elements of our operations. Then I think it's important when you think at the EU level, I think it's important to consider the EU as a single entity, okay, and not play the different EU countries against one another. Typically from a corporate perspective, we consider the EU not just as a whole, okay, there are different markets, but still it's a single market, and you want the EU to operate as a single entity in terms of industrial policy. So it's important to be at the EU level and to have a benchmarking capacity against the US and against China. And then finally, coming back to the debate that was discussed just previously, of course, you want to focus on the overall performance of the industrial policy. You want, in terms of the size and the value added generated by the industrial policy. but you should set up KPIs also that, help us identify and direct the fundings and all the efforts on the type of industry we want. And the ambition of the EU in that regard is pretty clear. We want, yes, of course, a stronger industry, but we want a greener industry. We want a more digital, a more innovative industry, and an industry that remains open to the outside world. So you can have KPIs that capture all of that, irrespective of the different ecosystems. Okay, it's really the idea is really to cover the whole spectrums of parameters that are relevant to the industry beyond just its share in the global economy. I'm going to leave it here, but just as a conclusion, I'd like to come back to one of the ambitions also of the EU industrial policy, which is to improve the political ownership of citizens of this industrial policy. I think it's a very fair and respectable objective, and I think we would all agree that we need some kind of a common narrative, to stick to as Europeans. And of course, you don't just build a narrative on an EU industrial policy or on KPIs. Okay, that's much more precise. You need something bigger. But the ambition that has been set by the European Commission in terms of the twin transitions, being a leader in terms of green transition, in terms of digital transition, I think it's something that can make sense at the EU level. But if you set up such an ambition, if you communicate on this and you try to take everyone on board on that, well, that's where actually implementing the EU strategy is very important, and that's where the KPIs become important, like not as a direct and something that you would push forward, but as a real means to implement things.
Thanks a lot, Amélie. Also a very comprehensive overview, but also very clearly stating what should not be done to have a meaningful selection of indicators and pursue indicators. I have perhaps a couple of curiosities just to keep you into the conversation for a few more minutes, but I have more, obviously. And if there are comments among the participants, not the ones up in live stream, but the ones that are in the call as well, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function here. The first is the structured cooperation, let's say, with corporates. So this is what I refer to when I say what should not be done, let's say, doing things only in-house without having a reality check, if you wish. And I was wondering whether the industrial forum that was launched recently by the Commission could, in your opinion, be the suitable place to have that type of exchange. The other is a more subtle curiosity that I have, because obviously there's a lot of literature, empirical studies on corporate social responsibility, and obviously there is a very broad spectrum of opinions on that, as to people that consider that to be really the engine or a potential engine of change, and others that are more skeptical. They talk about whitewashing or greenwashing and so on. But my question is, what is your opinion on that? Meaning, obviously, I take it that Saint-Gobain has its very proactive stance towards setting medium to long-term targets. First of all, what happens if your competitors don't do that, and you have cost, let's say, differences, differentials, because of the more ambitious strategy that you pursue? And what could regulation do in that respect? We are about to see a communication from the Commission on aligning better regulation with the Sustainable Development Goals. This might be a step towards maybe creating that regulatory environment that reassures and accompanies those companies that want to go towards this broader impact of the industry on society. But what else do you think could be done at the regulatory level to create that certainty, but not full reassurance, meaning you need to be in a competitive environment, but at least to incentivize positive behavior from an economic, social, and environmental perspective of European industry?
Do you want me to answer now, or yeah?
If you want, but
okay.
Otherwise, if you want to think about it.
Yeah, I don't want to be the sole speaker today. I'll be very quick, and then we can expand a little bit after the others have spoken. Yes, the industrial forum are an interesting evolution in terms of and hence and structured cooperation between the EU and the industrial world. But we already have a number of federations that are present at Brussels and that can be solicited. I've taken the example of the taxonomy, and clearly in terms of the taxonomy, the already existing federations that we have haven't really been heard. So, the structure is here already. It's good to add some more. But the European Commission can also use, all the people that are already here to explain the reality of our businesses. In terms of the corporate and social responsibility, you're right. Saint-Gobain is very proactive in this. It's a result of our history. It's also, related to corporate culture that we are very proud about. What if competitors don't do that? Well, I should say it's not really our business. We are convinced, and it seems that we are increasingly being followed. We are convinced that CSR is actually a source of profitable growth going forward. It's a source of attractiveness for talents, for HR. And I recruited again someone a few days ago for my team, and I can assure you that one of the drivers of people coming up to us is this. So it's a source of attraction for talents. It's a source of cost potentially, but it's also in many respects it's a source of profitable growth, in the sense that typically all of the environmental goals that we have, they help us make savings in terms of energy, in terms of circular materials, and that's a source of competitiveness for us. So we're not really afraid about that. And that's the last point also that I want to mention. Even if some companies are less proactive than we are, let me believe me if I tell you that the investor community is being proactive on behalf of other companies. We have a real pressure now from all of our stakeholders, our employees, our customers, and also our investors. So it's an overall direction, and I would really like you to believe me that there's been a real change in mindset in this regard over the past few years. So in terms of regulations, as EU companies, we are following the different regulation, and it's always a question, of sticks and carrots. So I don't think I can add much to that, except that we need regulations that don't hamper competitiveness and that help us align all interests in regards to the EU industrial strategy.
Thanks a lot, Amélie, also for staying and interacting. I like the fireside chat mode, also because we are as you heard, in a very broad conversation on industrial strategy. So I don't necessarily want to stick to pure back and forth. I mean, and also I invite also the other participants, whenever they want to chip in with a question, to do that, especially after everybody has had a chance to speak. So thanks also for the clarifications. I think this will be also an interesting bridge towards what Jarkko will have to tell us, right, Jarkko? So we'll hear from you now, from your presentation, and then who knows, maybe I have a couple of curiosities myself at the end of that. I see that there are some questions in the chat. So for the other speakers, feel free to check. There might be some questions for you on the Q&A section. So Jarkko, over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Andrea, and very glad to be with everybody this morning. So hi, my name is Jarkko Halas. I lead the Insights and Analysis program at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'll just be very brief about the foundation first, so you get sort of context of where I'm coming from and can put what I say into context better. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation started 10 years ago. It's a UK-based charity, and our mission since the beginning has been to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. We work with leading organizations across business, academia, governments, civil society, and we have about 2,000 companies in our network. So very interesting to hear some of the points that Amélie brought just now, and we try to stay very close on a daily basis working with companies in our network. We aim to generate knowledge on circular economy, and then based on that, mobilize systems globally and at scale to accelerate this transition from linear to a more circular future. One detail about our strategic priorities for this year is that we're working on circular economy performance measurement for companies. And that's a program that is under my sort of remit as well. So very interesting topic to be discussing with all of you today on metrics or indicators. Okay, I'll just go right to the point. So I wanted to convey two messages today. One is that it's increasingly difficult to decouple environmental performance from competitiveness. Interesting to hear from Amelie about, the CSR point, that it's not really about CSR, something that you do separate to your business, but more and more these environmental and social topics are material to business as usual. And that's the direction that we very much see as well, not just for circular economy, but more broadly, environmental and social topics. And the point that Andrea mentioned about competitiveness versus longer term goals for EU, they're not necessarily so different. And I think the timeline to having environmental topic as something that's material to your business is not so far off as the world moves on. And as indeed investors also take this topic up more and more. The second point is that circular economy is at the heart of this environmental performance for companies. So I'll just spend some time to sort of lay out the thinking behind these 2 points and start with environmental performance and competitiveness being interlinked. One aspect of this is that, more and more we see is that despite the sort of controversies with ESG metrics, so environmental social governance metrics, there is increasing body of evidence that companies that have high ESG scores actually perform well financially and are more robust in that sense, both from sort of empiric evidence from the markets, but also growing body of academic research that seems to generally agree with this statement. One reason for this is that companies that take environmental risks seriously are more resilient to shocks more generally as well, and therefore sort of generate longer term profitability. There is also an increasing sort of policy pressure on this, or sticks and carrots, I would say, both in Europe especially. And there is a business opportunity to be ahead of competition in making sure that you are aligned with what's coming up with, for example, EU taxonomy. And indeed, as Amelie mentioned, it's important that companies are close to that process. Circular economy specifically, so having circular economy of materials, using more secondary materials in producing goods, is a way to de-risk your dependence on imported materials, for example. It's a mechanism to distribute your value chains more, which has been an important topic, especially after this COVID crisis sort of unraveled some of the issues with having very concentrated value chains. When shocks happen to the system, it's good to be more distributed and less efficient in that sense also. And circular economy can help with job creation and adding high value jobs in Europe, where you don't necessarily manufacture somewhere else and import, but you have more sort of internal remanufacturing as one example. And some of the bigger European industrial companies actually have taken this very close to heart. And Renault, for example, is remanufacturing many sort of more complex parts, like I think gearboxes and engines now, as an example. And this all, of course, happens in Europe. And this link will only get stronger as time goes on. For metrics, there is unstoppable momentum now in standardizing how we eventually will be having mandatory sort of disclosure also for non-financial accounting. In private sector, there are many efforts in this space, and hopefully fewer and fewer efforts as sort of leading efforts come about, so that we get to truly standards. Some of the interesting ones are IFRS Foundation's Sustainability Standards Board that will be formed this year. The World Economic Forum and International Business Council have last September, I think, published a paper showing what a sort of standardized set of ESG metrics could be, and other efforts in that space. And I think there's more and more consolidation that will lead to a standardized set of disclosure indicators from environmental point of view, but also social. Especially for climate, there is also already lots of movement with policy regulation, large committed companies, large committed asset managers, also investors, to climate goals. And if you are left behind in this movement, there's a real risk of stranded assets and loss of competitiveness in general. And this will broaden very quickly, I think, from climate to other environmental topics, as they're seen largely as a package. Climate is a biodiversity loss. Climate change is a biodiversity loss driver, for one example, and the Science-Based Targets initiative that has until now focused on climate and emissions is now coming up with science-based targets for nature that will sort of bring a broader set of science-based targets for environmental outcomes. For Europe specifically, efforts in reshaping the economy after COVID have recognized the importance of environmental factors, and I think EU has a quite central role on more international global stage on this topic as well. Taxonomy being one of those elements. Taxonomy that is under the Green Deal. It aims to be a gold standard sort of for what good looks like on an environmental front. I think there's a real role for EU to lead this discussion and sort of create more broader standards beyond EU on the topic. And that again leads to competitiveness as well. If we in the future will have more sort of broad international ways of looking at what, for example, circular economy taxonomy or climate taxonomy is like, and Europe gets to be at the front of that, it will be a competitiveness argument too. So all of this points to making sure that environmental performance indicators are at the heart of measuring the degree of success for an industry strategy as well. I'll just briefly add a little bit more on circular economy for Andrea, who requested this, but transitioning to circular economy addresses, of course, the negative impacts of a linear take-make-waste economy, but it also is a more broad systemic shift for producing and using goods differently. It builds resilience, for example, value chain resilience, creates business opportunities, and provides then environmental and social benefits as well. For example, circular economy is a means to help solve global problems like climate change and biodiversity loss. Half of climate change impact is in the way we make and use goods and in the way we produce food. And the second half, or the other half, is in energy. So it's really important that materials are at the heart of climate strategies as well. It also links actually quite directly into the industrial strategy, EU industrial strategy. The Commission states that 3 drivers will transform industry: green transition, digital transition, and global competitiveness. And the green transition, of course, links to Green Deal. Green Deal has 2 environmental components in it. One is carbon neutral by 2050. The other one is decoupling economic growth from resource use. I mentioned that circular economy is a way to achieve this carbon neutrality, but the second one, decoupling growth from resource use, is actually, it's exactly what it is. It's about circular economy, achieving growth without increasing materials extraction and therefore the pressure on the environment. And so it's actually very integral to the industrial strategy. And therefore, of course, important to measure these aspects as well. So just to conclude there, the messages are competitiveness is close to environmental performance. And Europe is really in the driver's seat here to shape this agenda in Europe, of course, but more broadly as well. And therefore, making sure that becomes an internationally also an aspect of competitiveness. And the second point, role of circular economy that has already been recognized in Europe, in the EU, in the Green Deal, in the COVID recovery plans, will continue gaining momentum. And it's really a means for companies to achieve some of these broader environmental climate goals as well. So the implication is that, of course, then you need to be able to measure with good balance of indicators, and perhaps with a greater emphasis on the environment and circular economy as a delivery mechanism to positive environmental and social outcomes. And happy to continue the conversation today and then in the future also on a more technical level of what that could actually look like.
Thanks a lot, Jarkko. Very useful. Also, very interesting to hear from you that basically a message, because for many, many years we've considered the issue of competitiveness and the issue of, let's say, broader, more ambitious environmental targets to be somehow the two parts of a trade-off, if you wish, or somehow incompatible, right? But from Amelie's presentation, your presentation, you see a little bit an alignment of the stars now, meaning that investors are increasingly going, also thanks to the taxonomy and sustainable finance, I mean, going in the direction of giving a premium to those companies that actually have those broader objectives for the environment in particular. And that we saw also something you hinted at, that ESG leaders seem to have fared better during the pandemic than other companies on average, and perhaps they are more resilient. And so this is something that seems to be converging, but I'm still a little bit concerned, about the need for potential policy incentives that would further generate this alignment of incentives. So one question that I have for you is whether your environmental performance measurement goes also beyond the boundaries of the firm that you're measuring into the whole value chain, which is something that has become an important element of discussion at the EU level, including for example, the large digital platforms, but more generally also for the many industrial companies that have value chains at the global level. And the global value chains have been, if you wish, the poster child of a generation that gradually has turned into a cost-cutting, efficiency-oriented mindset, as opposed to maybe resilient, more risk-diversified mindset. So I was wondering whether you captured that, or you would capture that in the set of indicators that Paolo and his colleagues will have to propose in the end. And maybe I'll stick there, because otherwise it will take too long. So maybe I'll ask you only that question. As I see also questions piling up in our Q&A. Do you measure the impacts on the value chain as well? So sustainability of the overall value chain.
That's a very interesting question. There's a lot to unpack there in that question itself. And indeed, I mean, many variables, I would say, in this sort of deciding how distributed a value chain should be. And I'm sure it's very context specific. So I'm not sure how we would necessarily measure that, and sort of how do you take into consideration the different variables and elements that have to do with very sort of streamlined, efficient value chain versus more distributed and potentially resilient to shocks. But one thing is for sure, which is that the whole supply chain, like one company can't do a transformation, for example, to a more circular way of doing business alone. The whole ecosystem or whole supply chain needs to be part of that. If you want to procure more circular materials, you need to make sure that your suppliers actually have that. If you want to design your products differently and sell products that are easier to reuse or refurbish, you need to make sure that downstream your customers are understand the value of those and there are systems in place that allow those products to be used. So in that sense, it is indeed it's a value chain question. And just a brief anecdote from when we do this work with companies measuring circular economy performance with a tool we've developed, these topics are frequent. And for example, DS Smith, a cardboard packaging manufacturer, has now taken the circular economy measurement to 10 of their main suppliers to make sure that they start to kind of connect the dots in their supply chain and make sure that they all move at the same time, and that's indeed very important. No, probably didn't answer your question exactly, but
no, you did. I think in many respects, traditionally over the past years, the issue has been solved or addressed through issues such as sustainability reporting, or requiring some form of reporting or adherence to specific standards in what we call in the academic jargon transnational private regulation. Okay, that's a combination of very bad words altogether, but just to show things like GRI, but things in specific sector like, I don't know, Global Gap or the Forest Stewardship Council or many others that have sort of somehow reduce the cost of acquiring information on the practices in very dispersed and diffuse value chains, at the same time creating a problem of trust of what is behind. And this is also what leads me to Jude, because in particular in the compliance with the rights of workers, the global value chains have been heavily criticized when they relied on private standards and compliance. So I also was a little bit stimulated thinking about your potential intervention by Amelie's comment on the pan-European indicators, or whether there should be more, let's say, distributional considerations or inclusiveness consideration when it comes to member states, or whether there should be indicators that somehow apply to subsets of the EU territory. So yeah, that is just to set the stage for your intervention. Thanks for being with us, for being so interested, and also regularly attending the meetings of our Industrial Policy Task Force. So we are extremely happy and honored to have you again here with us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Yeah, for us, being part of this dialogue has also been quite rewarding and enriching for our internal discussions inside the trade union movement. So it's a two-way street in that respect. I guess I thought I would start with something which nobody's mentioned, from the mists of time, from the time of Günther Verheugen, when the target was 20% manufacturing, a target which was put up alongside the 3% for R&D and has been left behind in the midst of time. It's not an unproblematic target, looking at the changing nature of our industrial fabric and the way that industries have shifted. But I think it's worth setting out from the start, because from the perspective of industrial trade unions like Industrial Europe, we represent 7 million manufacturing, mining and energy workers across Europe, organized in all of the key trade unions across 38 countries in Europe. We're convinced, our starting point is that industrial decline in Europe is not a law of nature, and that public policy has a key role to play in ensuring a flourishing industrial fabric across the whole of our continent. For decades, our members have been pleading for strong, proactive and coordinated European industrial policy strategy. Therefore, we saw the new industrial policy strategy presented in March, unfortunately just 8 days before we all went into lockdown. We saw that strategy as a really welcome step in the right direction. But I think it's clear, and that's why the decision has been taken that it needs updating, that COVID has completely shifted the goalposts. It's intensified dramatically and accelerated deeper structural changes which are going on. It's also intensified and accelerated the dual transitions, both green and digital. And therefore, I guess our members and the discussion that we have internally actually is quite similar to what was presented right at the beginning by Frank, of the discussion of CEOs in companies, that we see the broad objective as it's great that now we have an industrial policy strategy with a clear objective and a narrative that people can get behind. But we have been frustrated now over years of flagship initiatives, industrial policy communications, which then haven't actually led to effective implementation on the ground. So this for us is actually a really key discussion, and it's to be fair, it's a discussion that we've also had previously with the ERT when they produced their report and in the work that they've been doing. And it's not, the ERT didn't invent the wheel in this debate either. I mean, there is an accumulation of the debate through these years of different industrial policy communications. We were involved in the development of KPIs, for example, in the Industry 2030 high-level working group, and there's a lot of meat for the Commission to use now to think about what works from the past, what is being put on the table by industry today, and what needs to be improved to reflect that broader objective of our industrial strategy, the resilience, sustainability, the just transition, which should now not be seen as you said, kind of trade-offs to international competitiveness, but actually, in our view, are the foundations for a strong European industry and strong competitiveness. I guess it depends in some ways how you define competitiveness. There's a low road, there's a high road. We don't see Europe's future as low road competitiveness. We won't win that race. So we have to go for the high road competitiveness. And that means many of the proposals put on the table by the ERT in terms of investment in R&D, investment ensuring indicators around rollout of infrastructure, ensuring targets and indicators linked to overhauling and improving and renovating our industrial fabric, but it also means integrating comprehensively, not just as a tag on, but actually integrating the environmental and the social dimensions into the strategy, as Jarkko has said. But directly coming to that point that you made about which links to Amelie's presentation about whether we go for Europe as compared to the world, or whether we also have an introspective view. In our view, we need both. Maybe that's the we want it all response. But if we don't have an introspective view, then we risk missing many of the fractures which fundamentally undermine the global competitiveness in our view. So last week in the European Industry Days, we organised a panel focused on leaving no regional worker behind, because we've been doing a lot of work over the last few months, in particular, looking at the situation in Central and Eastern Europe. Situation in terms of the green transition, situation in terms of the digital transition. And what's increasingly clear to us is that there is a real risk as we step forward now with the recovery plan, nationally bound national recovery strategies, and an industrial policy, which we have this debate. We know, all of us know, this bun fight going on at European level. Do we have a very proactive European industrial policy strategy, or more liberal, laissez-faire European policy, industrial policy strategy? The risk is that we will end up with fragmentation across Europe, with leading clusters, leading regions and countries heading out into this dual transition, and others facing being left behind, an entrenchment of regional inequalities across Europe. And that means that the KPIs that we choose and the way that we develop the indicators has to have an introspective view as well, because without that, we could end up with corrosion inside the European Union, which undermines our external competitiveness and our social cohesion, undermining our resilience, undermining the potential for just transition. For us, industrial collaboration and coordination across the EU are absolutely vital when you're looking at inequalities. And we have significant concerns about the recovery packages in this respect. Equally, the pandemic's shown the danger of becoming too dependent on a limited number of suppliers from outside. And I think, I'm not going to repeat it, I think Jarkko's made the case really clearly for why, therefore, you have to integrate the circular economy far stronger into the indicators and the secondary markets, recycling and so on. This is really key for us. And I guess in another respect, we have to think how we deal with strategic production, how you measure the strategic links in value chains. And their high-profile European initiatives, whether it's on semiconductors or other strategic value chains, will really only be measured in their real-world impact in sectors like the automotive industry and elsewhere. So I think there has to be this picture within the KPIs which are chosen. But what the main message that I wanted to stress today is, I think what you were expecting from me, which is the social dimension of those KPIs. Workers' involvement from the shop floor to strategic decision making is a key condition for a successful journey towards a sustainable, knowledge-based, resource-efficient, and high-performance industry. Industrial renewal and a thriving industry are only possible on the basis of quality jobs and constructive social dialogue at all levels. And for us, the just transition is not a concept of managing decline, but vital in the transformation of industrial jobs and the creation of new jobs, companies, and industries. So therefore, while the ERT's kind of balanced proposition includes some elements, particularly around training and STEM skills, which we welcome, we're completely missing the whole dimension of quality of work. And this for us is absolutely crucial. And it's not just a social concern, it's a European competitiveness concern. The member states that perform the best and have done over the last few years in terms of tackling unemployment, for example, are largely the same member states that record the highest levels of work quality. Those leading industrial clusters that I mentioned earlier also tend to be linked to better work quality and stable industrial relations. Our work on digitalization, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe, has really shown the investment damage in terms of digitalization of dominant low wage levels and the danger of low wage traps in terms of modernizing industry. So, and we can see elsewhere in Europe that the implementation of poorly planned digitalization increases work intensification and health and safety concerns. So if some of these factors aren't included in the strategy, you create corrosion from inside. And therefore, we think that the industrial strategy has to be better integrated with the agenda being prepared and actually presented, I think, this morning by the Commission of the Action Plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights. Concretely, what would this mean? Indicators around the quality of work. From workers' perspective, the quality of jobs can be measured through decent wages, job security, access to social protection, lifelong learning opportunities, decent working conditions in safe, healthy workplaces, reasonable working hours and the predictability of work, trade union representation and bargaining rights. And if you ask me which one would I pick out of all of that list, I would say that the coverage of collective agreements is the absolutely crucial one, because as the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and many others have now finally recognized, collective bargaining is actually the key instrument to addressing inequalities and job quality. So alongside job quality, we have the quality and inclusiveness of education and training. We know that we have an enormous challenge in terms of reskilling and upskilling in our economy. It's going to be a mammoth challenge. It needs not just engagement from public authorities, it needs engagement from industry, from the unions, from all stakeholders. And that is contrasted today by the very low levels of participation in vocational education and training. So that there we see that there are, and in the ERT proposals there, that is included, but the focus is always on graduates. It's always on graduates in STEM skills. What about apprentices? If we want to actually address the pyramids, the age pyramids in our industries, which are fundamental internal corrosive effect, if you like, as well, then we should also be talking about apprenticeships and having a link there. And finally, because I don't want to abuse my time, Amelie, I was really pleased to hear your emphasis on diversity of the workforce. A resilient workforce has to be a diverse workforce, and therefore bringing in and integrating KPIs around gender and around broader diversity in the workforce is absolutely crucial in our view. In fact, we did some really interesting work last year in the context of the World Manufacturing Forum, where there was a work stream on women in industry, which set out a whole series of recommendations from public authorities, employers, unions and academics, looking at how industrial policies should better integrate the gender dimension. At the moment, it's largely absent from the discussion, but if we want a resilient economy, we want a sustainable industry in the future, then we have to be using all of the talents in our society. So my last message, better mainstreaming. We don't need to try and do everything in the industrial policy strategy, but we have to do things better together, and we need to pull down some of the silos in European policy making and look at how we better integrate the agendas that we're building in terms of the European pillar of social rights and how that integrates then into the industrial policy strategy. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Jude. And I think you added quite a few additional ideas and suggestions to the list that for Paolo becomes increasingly long and complex. So I want to turn to him in a couple of minutes. Indeed, and perhaps as a bridge to Paolo, it is good for me as an academic. You know, sometimes it's good for me to sort of zoom out and look at things from a distance, right? And indeed, when we talk about indicators to track the performance or the success or the effectiveness of the industrial strategy, it is inevitable that we look at the industrial strategy as a means, right, rather than an end. Meaning, is the industrial strategy a means towards the broader, longer-term targets that we're giving ourselves? Or rephrasing this, would we expect some high degree of coherence, sometimes in the literature called policy coherence for sustainable development, and not by chance? Should we expect a very high level of coherence between the indicators that we use in the industrial strategy and the indicators that we use to track the let's call it performance or the effectiveness of the EU in achieving its own goals in the medium to long term? And the reason why I'm asking this is that if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals as the North Star for EU policy, as the European Commission has clarified, certainly for the semester, certainly for external action, whereas at the EU level, for perhaps obvious reasons, I mean, not all the aspects of the SDGs are fully covered with the same level of competence by EU institutions, but at least the Green Deal and the Just Transition, and also the initiatives on the rule of law largely cover that. Meaning, if this is true, that this is the North Star, then we need to incorporate things like Sustainable Development Goal 8 or 8.5, if you wish, the sub-indicator on full and decent employment for all in the industrial strategy. So I don't know if Paolo is having nightmares about this level of coherence to achieve, but you know, I had a similar problem, and not to cut a very long story short, when I started my experience a couple of years ago in the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, and the European Commission DG Connect asked me and the other 51 people that were with me to develop suggestions for the EU's competitiveness in AI. And I said, well, if I think about how to make the EU more competitive in AI, I might be going against the Sustainable Development Goals, or some of them in some cases. Meaning I might flood factories with robots much more than would be otherwise compatible with a more sustainable multi-dimensional strategy, right? So, and actually, you know, my impression is that I actually don't care about artificial intelligence if it doesn't lead us there. I mean, the most important thing is the frontier, and the rest is a means towards an end. I don't know if Paolo agrees with these or whether his work is going in that direction, but I think you've heard quite enough, and you probably knew already many of these things and heard them before, Paolo. But I was wondering whether this has somehow influenced your reaction in the coming minutes, or maybe your work over the coming weeks. So I give you the floor, and thanks for accepting in this turbulent time of the preparation of the communication to take stock with us on where you are with the indicators.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. I have to start with two apologies. The first one is that my neighbors are doing renovation works, so if you hear some drilling and hammering, well, bear with me. It's not nice, but there's nothing I can do about it. Second thing, which is more relevant, is that, well, as you know, the publication date for the what used to be called the March package has been postponed, and hence I cannot give you much details of what this package would contain, and also what the specific KPIs that will be selected will actually be in the final version. So today I will have to probably wear the hat of the economist or doing some research to help steering the discussion. Nonetheless, I'll try to give you a little bit of the context and and given, I think that given this context would also help me replying to Andrea's question, which I think is absolutely relevant. So the context, of course, is given by two main elements. The first is what I think we all read, the council conclusions that basically give the boundaries in which I have to, with my colleagues, find a balanced set of indicators to monitor industrial policy. I mean, the indications from the council are relatively clear. The council wants, first of all, some dimensions to be covered. These are the green transition, the digital transition, and the resilience. They also mention explicitly the open strategic autonomy. They mention resilience, and they also mention comparisons with the rest of the world, so external competitors. Although the political discussion is still ongoing, I can already tell you with a certain degree of certainty that these elements will be somehow examined by the KPIs. The council also asked for a brief written report accompanying these KPIs, which might sound like as a bureaucratic needs or exercise, but it's actually important, and that because here I go to what Andrea was asking before. KPIs without some analysis are not particularly relevant in my view. So KPIs are important, monitoring is important, but we should not have too many expectations on just looking at single numbers in isolation without examining not only how they evolve over time and how they evolve compared to external competitors, but also how the different KPIs interact with each other, whether there are trade-off against, that basically make them difficult to have both of them as targets, for instance, and hence how a balanced economic policy or industrial policy should take into account these trade-offs. And I think examining also these elements will be part of this written reports that, in my view, will be extremely important. Now, the second part of the context I was mentioning before is that the set of KPIs that we will publish in April, hopefully, or we'll see when, is not an isolated set of KPIs. Actually, if you only consider the European Commission, there is such a wealth of dashboards, scoreboards, that you really have to consider this set of KPIs in this broader context. In the last days, I made some research also because I want to limit to the extent possible the overlaps with what already exists. And it's very difficult to come up with one indicator that is not already covered by something else. You have the single market scoreboard, the innovation scoreboards, you have the circular economy indicators, you have the raw material scoreboards. The Digitrade published a lot of some statistical guides on trade numbers. Eurostat provides a huge amount of nice dashboards where any citizen, even without any background in economics, can examine all sorts of indicators grouped by themes with very nice interactive tools online. So, I mean, the European Commission is really doing a lot in terms of KPIs, probably even too much in a way. I think that's an important element, especially in reply to some of the statements made by Frank and by Amélie. Now, of course, what we have in mind is more or less, what already is included in the council conclusion. That is, of course, we will have some headline indicators, and these will probably be the usual suspects, value added and productivity and the likes. So nothing particularly surprising there. And then we will for sure take into account the elements like the digital transition, green transition, the strategic autonomy, and the resilience, because these are, let's say, the explicit requests of the council. This said, there are, the other, let's call them classic elements of the industrial policies, like, the SMEs or the single market performance, which will also be for sure part of this set of indicators. Now, in selecting the specific indicators, we have to face some constraints, and that is, I think, it's important also to set the expectations right. The first is that, to the extent possible, given the political nature of this exercise, also analytical, but there's also political nature behind this exercise, is that we are trying to stick to public sources of data. And that, for obvious reasons, not only of reliability, but also of transparency and replicability. We want everybody to be able to check our calculations, monitor in real time whatever we set as a KPI. Of course, then on a more technical ground, we're trying to select indicators for which we have a decent data coverage. That means time series that are long enough to make significant statements in terms of, but also good sectoral coverage. Very important, or best to define KPIs based on timely data. Now, this is probably the biggest constraint. We know that many of the official statistics come with quite a significant lag, for obvious reasons, not criticizing the statistical authorities, but of course, when it comes to monitoring, especially for policies that have a real impact in terms of citizens' welfare, and not only for what concerns the environmental aspect, but also for a broader sense of sustainability. Of course, having data that dates back to 3 years ago is not particularly useful in terms of monitoring of the situation on the ground. So this is an important limit. The last point is, of course, that we want these indicators to be clear and easy to interpret. So we're trying to avoid overly sophisticated composite indicators that whose interpretation might be complicated. Last elements of my intervention would be that we have what will this KPIs describe in terms of sectoral coverage, let's call it this way. And here we are thinking about fundamentally 3 dimensions. There will be some horizontal indicators, as Frank rightly pointed out. But we want to cover not only industry, we also want to cover services, because I think this dichotomy between industry and services is a little bit not satisfactory in terms of the reality of industry now. Then on top of this, let's say we're going to call it horizontal or say macro sectoral type of indicators, we will also have something describing the famous 14 ecosystems. Of course, these are more complex to calculate because the definition of the ecosystems require bundling together many different sectors, and hence in terms of data availability, that is a bit more complicated. with that, probably I will just conclude with a couple of remarks if I still have the time. Andrea, please stop me if necessary.
No, you can go ahead, Paolo.
I have so a couple of remarks. First of all, I think managing the European Union, or for what matter any other country, is different than managing a firm or a company, no matter how big the company is. Hence, I think it's a bit dangerous to use this, let's say, this narrative for which, just as firms have their targets and their KPIs, so should the EU through the industrial policy, etc. I mean, and the reason is that, of course, the European Union has a much wider set of objectives than any firm, even the largest of the firms, and hence defining very specific KPIs is very difficult for the very reason that Andrea mentioned before. So there are clear trade-offs between these KPIs, and so the role of, in this case, the European Commission, but for any other document, is to find the right balance for that. And this right balance is very difficult to set into numerical targets, whatever they are. The last bit, and I think that answers also one of the questions in the chat. We had to avoid the confusion between monitoring and targets. Setting KPIs or let's say highlighting the importance of some specific KPIs is different than setting a target for policy reasons. And I would like to, I think in the intervention of some of the panelists, I've somehow felt this tension, and I think I would like to keep these two elements very separate. Setting targets in some cases is extremely important. It's the right way to go about it. But when we have concepts like competitiveness or resilience, which are extremely wide and which can have potentially many different interpretations, you have to be very careful in setting indicators as targets, because by doing that, you basically risk narrowing in a way that is not necessarily satisfactory a concept that by its own nature is very multidimensional. And with that, of course, I stop, and I'm happy to take any question or criticism.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. We managed to hear perfectly your intervention, but just wanted to warn you that unless you are extremely good at standing still, your image is frozen over the past few minutes, but we've heard you very well. And thanks actually, because you managed to dance around the specific details, what you actually have to do, but you gave us a lot of information on how you are about to do it. So that is very important. We have a number of questions already in the Q&A section. I will start maybe bringing them into the debate. I was wondering whether Amélie wanted to say something, since the original question in the Q&A was on indicators versus targets, and Paolo has covered that. Whether Amélie wanted to briefly comment on this. It's fair for me to give you the floor, or at least to offer to give you the floor in that respect, or not.
Well, I take the point that that Paolo made, that if you have very broad objectives, it's very hard to narrow them down to an indicator and to associate the target with that. But in the ERT documents, they managed to have this set of indicators associated with a target for each indicator. The good thing about this is that it helps embark everyone. If you have an indicator without any specific target over a definite period of time, then I would argue, okay, you're tracking an indicator. Say you're tracking the the evolution in emissions by your industry. Okay, that's one of the indicators recommended by the ERT. Greenhouse gas emission. Okay, you're tracking this indicator. If you're not giving any targets, then how do you ensure you're aligning everyone's interest into that direction? So it's about striking a balance. I guess it's always about striking balance between the target and the indicator. So to answer to Paolo's point, maybe one way to try and associate the two is to try and find KPIs that are generic enough to enable to cover some of the large concepts that we're trying to reach with the EU industrial policy. But I think giving up the quantified targets, then it kind of dilutes our overall responsibility to get where we want to go.
Thanks, Amélie. I don't know if other panelists wants to get into the conversation. Otherwise, I might ask Cinzia, who has a question, to step in, and then we continue with the questions and also that we have in the Q&A. But I think this is somehow related to the choice of indicators versus targets. So maybe Cinzia, bring you in at this point with your question.
First of all, many thanks to all for such an interesting and enlightening discussion. I want to go back to one point that was raised by Judith, but it links very much to one of the points that Paolo made, which is about basically the fact that we are talking about an EU industrial strategy and the EU has many different objectives. And one particular aspect that was mentioned, it was the issue of having an introspective view. And in particular related to the fact that in Europe, industrial production is actually often very concentrated in agglomeration. And some regions tend already to lag behind. With the transitions, it's actually very likely that some regions will not be able to keep up with it. And then the question is, to what extent the industrial strategy should take this into consideration? And in the context of indicators, would it be useful to have some indicators which track the regional performance? So this is, Andrea, if allow me, I want to maybe to bring in a second question, which actually was very much also inspired by one of the questions in the chat. I mean, now, of course, we're having this discussion with speaking at large businesses, but in Europe, production is also very much driven by SMEs. Now, we had the chance to actually did a study not long ago about NFRD, so the non-financial reporting. What we discovered is that the large businesses are very much engaged actually in all the issues which go beyond like financial indicators. When it comes to SMEs, we see that they're facing much more troubles and difficulties. To what extent we need to take this aspect into account when formulating the industry strategy? So sorry, two very different questions, but I think they're actually quite important. Thanks.
All right, let me see who wants to take Cinzia's questions. I don't know if it's any of the panelists. Judith, yes, go ahead. That's what
I'm happy to be brave, and I guess the first question about the regional performance is really crucial for us as trade unions, because it ties to this question of policy coherence and how we ensure that the industrial policy strategy is tied together with the broader Green Deal and just transition plans. So we have regional, or member states are meant to be making, and regions are meant to be making regional plans currently for just transition, which would be about the transformation of the industrial fabric and how particularly carbon intensive regions are going to adapt. In our view, if we don't have that regional dimension integrated into the overall European industrial strategy, then the danger is that that we will head towards really a hypercluster view of European industry. And I'm not too worried about what happens within those very advanced clusters. If I'm honest, I'll probably get into trouble with some of my members for saying that, but not too worried about that. My real worry is what happens in regions which will deindustrialize, because the social and economic impact will have a very, very long shadow, and will have not just a long shadow in terms of the social and economic impact, but also a long shadow in terms of the political impact. And I think that needs to be integrated into our thinking about the industrial policy strategy. And it's why I really insist that we can't just have an agenda around indicator. We think that having benchmarks and having a plan for all the reasons that Amelie set out is really important, so that people are part of the narrative. It's also part of building the narrative and people understanding the direction of travel. Everybody knows that they're not the only indicators, but it's about the narrative. If you don't have the regional dimension included, then not everybody is part of the travel and part of that story. And I think that's a really important part of the industrial strategy at this very specific historical moment, where we have a policy-led change through the Green Deal. This isn't, this is political intervention to shift the economy. Digitalization is more an industry-led shift, if you like, but the Green Deal in particular demands that we then have the industrial policy framework to bring everybody along with us. So the regional dimension is really crucial. But obviously, I recognise that for the people who make and monitor the indicators, it's kind of a nightmare. So I apologise for that, but it should somehow, we have to get that into the package and the picture.
I guess it would be quite an additional layer of complexity in terms of, finding the data, finding the appropriate indicators, and I don't know, maybe Paolo can expand on that, but I think that the concept would be highly complex in terms of follow-up of the policy.
Yeah, I don't know, Paolo, if you want to chip in, or maybe I can add to this level of complexity another one, because I don't know, I want to provoke you a little bit on this, because you mentioned the ecosystems, right? And this is one of the looming questions as to whether you'll manage to set indicators for the ecosystems, and whether there will be room for setting indicators on so-called strategic value chains, which is another animal in the in the forest in the jungle of the indicators, and of the clusters of the units of measurements that have been lingering on the activities, particularly DigiGrow, over the past years. So regional dimensions and levels of aggregation. Is there anything that you can share with us in that respect?
Yes, I hope you can see me moving now. I'm not sure, but yeah, good. So in terms of the regional dimension, I would like to acknowledge in this context the amazing work that my colleagues in DG Regio are doing. There are a lot of reports. There's a particular one, I think it's a biannual report that calculates a wealth of indicators that are very relevant for industrial policy as well. And it's done at the regional level and with very nice maps and rich data set. So I think that's the reference for that. Of course, I totally agree with you that having this dimension in industrial policy would be also extremely significant. Of course, it's always a matter of trying to limit a little bit the boundaries of the exercise. Because as we discussed before, in principle, there are so many dimensions we could try to measure. And ultimately, I think this is the reason why there are so many scoreboards in the European Commission. That is, think about also what you mentioned before about vocational trainings. Also on that, there are many indicators. for each of these dimensions, in principle, if you really wanted to measure that properly, you will need to use probably 10, 15 different indicators. Now, if you multiply that by all the dimensions that industrial policy could directly or indirectly cover, you end up with a Christmas tree. I mean, it could be, you know, basically repackaging the whole Eurostat products into some kind of document. And you really have to wonder, you know, what is the added value of such an exercise? So I think that's where I think the real reflection should be. You know, given what is already done, not only by the European Commission in the policy DGs, but also by Eurostat itself, which is also part of the European Commission. And what is done by all the other institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, etc. So we really have to focus on the added value of that initiative. And I think that's where the difficult discussion comes in. In terms of the ecosystems and the strategic value chains, so two elements. For sure, there will be some indicators for the ecosystems. Of course, it will be extremely difficult to go into the details of each of the dimension of the policy, the industrial policy for the ecosystems. And the reason is mainly data availability. The problem is that, and the beauty also of the ecosystems is that they cover very different aspects of the economy, and basically very wide set of different sectors. And is for some indicators, it's not straightforward to find data sources that cover all the different sectors that would be needed. Now, of course, in some cases, you can take shortcuts and describe what you can, and eliminate some of the other ecosystem or the other subsectors. But we are doing our best to keep a sort of homogeneous definition of these ecosystems throughout the different indicators we'll have, even if that results in possibly in a smaller set of KPIs. But at least that would give a flavor not only of the performance of the ecosystems, but also of describing what this ecosystem actually look like, because this has been a question that many people have been wondering. So that's the idea. On the strategic value chains, for time being, we have not considered that in the main set of KPIs, but of course that might change. As I said, there's still a lot of uncertainty about it, but rest assured, in the package there will be several, let's say, more thematic staff working documents, and in that, in a way, I think we will cover many interesting aspects that, in a way, can also be related to key strategic value chains. Note also that in all these staff working documents and in the communication as well, there will probably be also other indicators that are more specific to what we will be describing. So in total, I think that the different indicators we'll be using will be quite many, and it's good news. It's a lot of work for us, of course, but I think it's good news for everybody.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. I'd like to bring Jarkko into this final part of the conversation before we go into the wrap-up. Also because you have two questions, one from Peter Neuns and one from Gonzalo Lopez, that hint at the need for potential binding targets to further incentivize the circular economy. And also Peter mentions the recent position of the European Parliament, and Gonzalo asked the question very early on during our debate, really aims at asking whether spontaneous convergence and the alignment that we described before, also between investors and industry and other stakeholders, whether they will be enough, or whether, in your opinion, there is a need for an additional push from the public policy perspective. So maybe Jarkko, you are best positioned to answer that question.
I'll try. Binding targets. I think there is still, well, one thing that Paolo mentioned is that there is a data availability question in Europe, for example, through Eurostat on first having something to set binding targets on, I guess. Some of you may know this Bellagio principles for circular economy measurement on sort of public sector EU level that would attach to the Green Deal that was going on last year. And we had experts from Eurostat as a part of that process and indeed recognized that we need something more than recycling rates, essentially, that is describing the materials recirculation today. And so I think there's some ways to go there. I'm not a policy expert, but eventually, of course, we will need some binding targets on different levels to make sure that the whole transition happens to a circular economy. But it needs to be something more than recycling rates eventually. As a sort of anecdote, recycling is really the last resort of keeping materials in use. The idea in circular economy is to keep materials at as high value as possible at all times. So going from reuse to repair, eventually when you can't anymore repair something, you recirculate the materials in recycling. So that's something we need to more closely ingrain to how we measure this topic.
Thank you, Jarkko. And just to echo your point, so you have a comment, just check it out in the Q&A from our colleague Hien Vu on a specific issue related to the steel and aluminum sectors. And there's also, to some extent, something that I would save for Philip's reaction at the end, which is a comment from Marie that sort of hints at the specific difficult moment, let's say, in having full trust in industry because of what is happening with vaccine distribution. So I leave you the hot potato, Philip, when you come at the end to wrap up, meaning that is this the right moment to place full trust in industry when we see what's happening in that specific sector? And is this something that you would, obviously it's difficult for you to subscribe entirely to this, but how do you see the whole thing evolving, or how do you see potential trust enhancing mechanisms around this process? On Jarkko's opinion, I think I might take in group maybe a couple of other comments that we've received. Then and add maybe those as a final part of our Q&A. There are questions in particular around the twin transition, and in particular, Alessandra was asking a question about the role of digital and whether the digital and ICT in the draft delegated act for the EU taxonomy are insufficiently recognized, and whether this also would be a potential problem in representing the twin transition. I add to Alessandra's question, in the indicators that will be used in the industrial policy, so in the industrial strategy. So how is digital going to be captured, and should digital be captured in specific ways? I, as an expert in digital policy, for example, I'm a bit more skeptical than Frank or Philippe or maybe Amélie on 5G as a trustful, a faithful indicator of progress on the industrial strategy, because I do believe that the future of industry will be related to a much more complex mix of technologies for connectivity, not just 5G. But that is my opinion, obviously. So I don't know if none of you is necessarily, well, a little bit Jude, obviously, because she comes from a tech sector union. But whether any of you has specific comments on those aspects or the aspect of digital technologies in the future indicators. Maybe Paolo, if you, I don't know if you can anticipate anything in that respect, whether advances in the digital transition will be, or beyond the existing indicators like the DESI or others, will be incorporated. Should we expect anything brand new in the communication on digital or not?
Well, what you said is very important. I think measuring the digital transition is is one of my major headaches in the last days. And of course, we have the DAISY, which is it's a very good indicator. It has many subcomponents that can give a lot of information on specific aspect of the digitalization process. But of course, we wish we had more than that, particularly for what concerns the newest technology. But of course, on those things, I think we do have some scattered information, but it's very difficult to find something that, let's say, fulfill all the requirements we set ourselves for this particular exercise. That is, having good coverage of the EU 27, including also a decent coverage or in terms of time and sectors. So that is a little bit difficult for us, but we are working on that. And of course, we are very happy to take any suggestion from any of the participants. Since we have more time now for the publication of the package, then we can as well profit to include an improvement on that.
All right, very good, Paolo. Now let me see if there are final comments that any of the panelists want to provide before I hand over to Philippe. I might leave to Philippe also one of the pending questions on the inclusion of SMEs in the indicators. I think this might be something that you might want to comment on. But let me see, first of all, whether Amélie, Jarkko, or Judith, or Paolo have something else that they want to add that they think has been insufficiently covered, or an opinion that you want to express on what others have said. Amélie.
Yeah, just one point, and then I'll leave the floor to Judith. Yeah, one point that Paolo made about the fact that they also want to cover services because they feel that the frontier, the border between industry and services is being blurred. I think it's an interesting point, and I would agree from an industrial company's point of view that the frontier is increasingly blurred. So typically we produce goods and physical goods, industrial goods, but we also more and more produce the services that are associated to that. So I think it's pretty interesting to wait and see what the Commission is going to come up with on this.
Very good, Judy.
Yeah, well, I agree with that comment. As I said in my intervention as well. I guess I just wanted to come back to the point about the Christmas tree. I don't think we're asking for a Christmas tree. I don't think we're asking for Father Christmas to appear in the industrial policy strategy as well. But I think that the Commission should be careful to ensure that there is, if you like, a nod towards all of the dimensions of the broader goals of the industrial policy strategy. So not 30 indicators on vocational training, but including vocational training within is really important for us. Not everything on quality of work, but including a notion of the quality of work within is really important for us. So I just wanted to make it clear that, I can give you a shopping list of all the indicators we would like. We also don't think that would add a lot of value to the overall exercise. But what we want to see is that the kind of progress which is being made in, for example, the European Pillar of Social Rights is reflected in terms of our agenda for industrial competitiveness. Thanks.
Thanks to both. And the point on services is, I think, very, very important. I might have a yes/no, a yes/no type of a question to Paolo, because you know very well that data are obviously an important component in particular the service economy. Commissioner Breton has been quite vocal in considering as a target, if you wish, the increase in the EU's share of the data economy, which could be, or the realignment between the EU share of the data economy and the EU share of the global economy. Hopefully, an alignment from the current low use share of the data economy towards the higher percentage, which is the use share of the global economy. Will this be an element in the indicators that you consider to be part of the success of the industrial strategy or not? If you can, if you can answer.
The honest answer is I don't know yet. It's of course a very important. Let's put it this way, indicator for that. So we are working with our colleagues in DG Connect, which are in any case part of what we call the Breton family, to make sure that we have significant indicators to measure all the developments. But it's a bit of a work in progress.
Thanks, Paolo. I think it's been a very fascinating debate. The only thing that is left for me is to hand over to Philippe, who will wrap up this conversation. So Philippe, I think we've learned quite a lot. So thanks for co-organizing this with us, and I give you the floor.
Okay, well, Andrea, thank you for this, and thank you for a very fascinating and extremely interesting session. Because what we notice and what is remarkable, and thank you also to all the panelists for this, is that the discussion is shifting from can and should there be indicators to how and what shall we exactly measure. And that is an important achievement, and that's progress in itself. And we believe it's also very significant if not only representatives from industry, but also from trade unions, or also from environmental charities, agree on the relevance of these KPIs, and that there needs to be indeed also social indicators, that we can have introspective as well as international benchmarking indicators. And therefore, in terms of conclusions or wrap up, we believe indeed that a balanced scorecard might be the best way out. And many thanks also to Paolo and his colleagues in the Commission for giving this so much thought, because it is an extremely complex exercise. Nobody will disagree with this. But we are extremely pleased to hear the reflections you've put in so far already. And from having made this exercise ourselves when producing our publication on KPIs back in November, we've had these same discussions on data availability, on time lags, and then we always came to the conclusion that we need to have a wide variety of indicators, that the best is often the enemy of the good, and that having these indicators in themselves will produce a lot of interesting stuff for analysis, food for thought at future competitiveness councils, in the industry forum, in the different ecosystems, and therefore also repackaging what is being done by other parts of the Commission and by Eurostat is valuable to look at it through the lens of competitiveness. And we totally agree, indicators and numbers in themselves are not relevant enough. It needs to go hand in hand with additional analysis, hopefully in these future competitiveness reports. Now, there was a question indeed on including SMEs in indicators. Yes, of course, because it's mainly for SMEs that these indicators can be helpful. Sometimes larger companies manage to get around even in complex regulatory environments. But why should we track a horizontal aspect such as the ease of doing business? Well, that's also to let SMEs scale up faster. And how can we measure resilience and making sure that enough masks and vaccines will be rolled out and manufactured faster in the future? That was another question. Well, that's also by tracking it. We might not need targets for every single policy that the Commission is deliberating upon, but let's at least measure and track via indicators what the progress is, so that we can correct course where needed. Maybe to end with other reflections on what other countries or what other parts of the Commission are doing. We very much look forward to also on the 9th of May, a communication is expected on the digital decade, on the digital compass. It is von der Leyen herself in her State of the Union who asked for targets, in this sense, even targets for 2030 on a number of digital indicators. So that can be inspiring as well. Besides this, in other corners of the Commission, foresight reports are being produced now. We had the first edition in September of this year. And next edition might hopefully look at, well, the foresight for competitiveness by the 2030 horizon. And maybe there also data and evidence can be repackaged. For the European semester, it will also be relevant to have enough data on where are the green and digital transitions going, and on up and reskilling and the quality of work, where are the recovery funds making an impact. Also, therefore, these competitiveness reports in the future can be a useful yardstick. And last but not least, we're also wondering what China will come up with. This week, a new fifth 5-year plan is expected. Now, the European Union shouldn't copy China, but we might take inspiration from how they set targets and how they measure progress. And I will leave it at that. And there's a lot to discuss also in future seminars and webinars, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you to all the panelists and to SEPS for organizing.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. I would like to give Frank the possibility, maybe Cinzia, a possibility to give us their final statements, and then we will wrap up in the next couple of minutes the event. So Frank, over to you.
Yes, also thank you from my side for this very, very rich debate. And I very much agree with Philippe that it's important no longer the if, but much more the how. And as you know, I'm Dutch. I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands we like to ride our bikes. And we even had the honor of Albert Einstein. He was in the Netherlands for a while. And then maybe that's why he came up with the quote that life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you need to keep on moving. And that's also true for competitiveness. It's and to keep the balance between people, planet, profit. You know, to create a prosperity for all of us, we need to have, let's say, these indicators to make sure that we keep on moving and moving into the right direction. So hopefully, with some food of thoughts from Albert Einstein and on riding your bike and keeping that balance, I hope that could also be a reflection for you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Frank. And who are we to contradict Einstein in that respect? So, Cinzia, do you want to officially wrap up the meeting? And
very, very quickly from my side, I want to thank you all, because I think the conversation was really very interesting, and a number of the messages actually will be very useful to streamline. I think it was used earlier, this word, all the amount of information and discussion that we had, and actually to come up with answers to my initial questions about really the identification of the objective and how actually this broad objective can be streamlined and measured with indicators which can help us actually to track the progress in the future. So I will leave it here, and many thanks to all.
All right, thanks a lot, Cinzia. This brings us to an end. Cinzia, Frank, Amelie, Jarko, Judith, Paolo, and Philippe, thank you very much. Thanks to all the people at SEPS that have been working behind the curtains to let us run successfully this seminar. And I wish you, since it's noon, a very good afternoon to all of you and the rest of the day. Take care and see you soon in other events.